Throughout the course of the Second World War, more planes than any other period in time obtained legendary status. There is, however, one plane that deserves to be cited alongside the Spitfires, Bf-109s, Lancasters and Mustangs alike. A plane produced more than any other throughout the war, the workhorse of the Soviet Air Force, and at the time one of the best ground attack aircrafts. This is the history of the Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik. In the Soviet Union, designs for armoured ground attack planes had been appearing since the early 1930s, with planes like the TSH-1 and 2 armoured biplanes, designed by Dmitry Pavlovich Grigorovich. However, these models met a dead end, since the Soviet Union at the time weren't capable of producing an engine powerful enough to afford these armour-plated planes with good enough performance. This meant that the idea had to be set aside for the time being. It wasn't until 1938 that the Soviet aircraft designer Sergei Ilyushin and his team at the Central Design Bureau in Moscow came up with the first prototype of what would eventually be the IL-2. The first prototype was the TSKB-55 and was a single-engine, low-wing, two-seater plane that came with a 700kg protective shell around the cockpit, engine, radiators and fuel tank. When this prototype was fully loaded, it weighed around 4.7 metric tons. This meant that the plane's armour made up for around 15% of the total mass, making it the most heavily armoured plane at the time. The only plane with similar armouring up until that point was the German Junkers J-1, which was developed during the Great War. The principle behind both these planes was the use of monocoque structure. The design principle behind a monocoque is to have the outer shell of the plane be the structural load bearer. This design philosophy is often compared to eggshells, if that helps. Instead of having support beams throughout the plane covered in thin metal sheets or canvas, the metal of the exterior would bear all the structural load. This prototype made its first flight on the 2nd of October 1939. Having proven itself in early testing, the prototype was entered into a government competition and ended up winning against the Sukhoi 6. As a result, the plane was adopted by the Soviet Air Force for further development and received the Soviet Air Force designation BSH-2, the BSH standing for Bronirovanny Sturmovik, which translated to Armoured Ground Attacker. The problem with the BSH-2 was that it was too heavy for the original Mikulin AM-35 engine, which performed best at high altitudes, which wasn't exactly ideal for a ground attacker. In an attempt to work around the engine's limitations, the TSKB-57 was designed, which was a single-seater as opposed to the two-seater design of the previous model, and featured the new AM-38 engine, which was optimized for operating at lower altitudes. These changes naturally cut down on the plane's overall weight and greatly improved the performance on the whole. This prototype first flew on the 12th of October 1940. Shortly thereafter, in March of 1941, the plane passed the state acceptance trials and was tweaked in order to be more easily mass-produced. Along with all these changes came a new name. From this point onward, the aircraft would be known as the IL-2 or IL-2 Sturmovik. Since testing in 1940, it had been decided that the plane was to be armed with two 23mm MP6 guns, designed by the Belarusian weapon designer Yakov Grigorovich Taubin, whose claim to fame was the invention of the first automatic grenade launcher. The gun was originally fed by a clip, but due to problems with the clip dislodging with high aerodynamic pressure, the gun was changed to be belt-fed. The gun also used a short recoil system. For this design, Taubin was awarded the Order of Lenin. In May of 1941, Taubin's gun had to compete with the new gas-operated Volkov-Yartsev VYA-23, which was also a 23mm autocannon. The VYA-23 was quite similar, but ended up replacing Taubin's gun. What followed is an example of the Stalinist Soviet Union's inhumane brutality and total disregard for human life. After Taubin's design had been retired, he was abruptly arrested alongside many of his associates for supposedly preserving samples of unfinished weapons and egregiously plotting production of technically unfinished and unsatisfactory weapon systems. It is rumoured that some Russian army higher-ups took personal issues with Taubin or hated Taubin because of their distaste for the automatic grenade launcher, and saw this as an opportunity to get rid of him. Following his prosecution, Taubin was sent off to the village of Barbish near Samara in Russia, where he was executed by shooting on the 17th of October 1941 Under Stalin, Samara housed a mass grave where many of the Soviet Union's victims of execution were buried. I know I went off on a bit of a tangent here, but I believe it's highly important that we must never forget what Stalinism was, and that we must remember the names of its victims. To quote Lawrence Binion, "They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old." In the same month that the VYA-23 was accepted, the IL-2 would already be shipped off to operational Air Force units, only 1 month before Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The top speed of these early IL-2s was around 414 km per hour. When Operation Barbarossa began, the Soviet Union only had 249 IL-2s ready to go. It was clear that more planes like the IL-2 would be needed to repel the German army's enormous tank divisions. With the unexpected German invasion, production was hit very hard, with many of the Soviet aircraft factories being situated in the western parts of the USSR and around Moscow, which forced them to move east of the Ural Mountains. It would take 2 months after the move for production to resume. The production rate of a couple of the factories wasn't exactly up to Stalin's liking, resulting in him writing a telegraph upholding the classic Stalin charm, which read, "You have let down our country and our Red Army. You have the nerve not to manufacture IL-2s until now. Our army now needs IL-2s like the air it breathes, like the bread it eats. Schenkman produces 1 IL-2 a day, and Tretyakov builds 1 or 2 MiG-3s daily. It's a mockery of our country and the Red Army. I ask you not to try the government's patience, and demand that you manufacture more IL-2s. This is my final warning." Quite the charismatic leader, I know. After this telegraph, the factories managed to push out more planes, whilst working their workers around the clock in miserable conditions. The IL-2 first saw service within the 4th SHAP, or Ground Attack Regiment, over the Berezina River only a few days after the invasion had begun. At this point, the plane was still very new, and the pilots lacked any advanced training in the aircraft. As a result, the squadrons were only trained to take off and land with the plane, and didn't have any specific tactics, and had never fired their weapons. Despite this severe lack of training, the pilots found great comfort in the heavy armouring of the plane and its fairly easy handling. The ground crews also received no training in maintenance, servicing, or rearming the IL-2. In these early stages of the invasion, the ground attack squadrons were often tasked with attacking panzer divisions, supply convoys, and destroying key bridges in an attempt to slow down the German advance. It's important to note that the IL-2's aerial operations were for the most part held near the front lines, not far behind enemy lines, as would be typical for tactical bombing squadrons. The problems the squadrons faced, in addition to German airfield strikes, led to the 4th Ground Attack Regiment losing 55 out of its original 65 IL-2s, and many of its pilots along with them. Needless to say, revisions had to be made in the tactics and training of IL-2 crews. As the Soviet air crews grew more familiar with the IL-2, they came to know its strengths and weaknesses, and they quickly improved on their aerial tactics. Instead of attacking enemy tanks and convoys in a straight approach at low altitudes of about 50 meters, which left them very susceptible to surface-to-air defenses, the Soviet Air Force came up with a multitude of different flying formations. In general, it was common for the pilots to approach their targets on their left, turning sharply and going into a 30-degree dive. IL-2 squadrons would also be escorted by Yak-1 fighters. One of the most common tactics for attacking convoys and tank columns was zigzagging over the columns one by one, dodging anti-aircraft artillery and flak, attacking the targets at each crossing. Another variant of this tactic was the scissor approach, where 2 planes would approach at a time flying side by side, and then suddenly splitting off into individual converging and diverging zigzags, and like the last tactic, attacking on each crossing. At the time, the IL-2, in addition to their 23mm autocannons, would also be equipped with rockets and bombs. Probably the most popular and effective tactic was the so-called circle, in which the IL-2 would approach a column in a line from high altitudes, and in quick succession dive onto the column below, strafing the entire line. After having completed the first strafe, the planes would use their momentum gained in the dive to pull up and start circling back to attack from the same angle as the initial attack, and linking up with the last plane of the line, creating a circle, and repeating the process, leaving the convoys under continuous, uninterrupted fire. having all the planes following each other also made the circle a great defensive strategy if the squadron was under fire by enemy fighters, as each pilot could cover the squad mate in front of them. In the early stages of the invasion, the Soviet Air Force was going through a shortage of fighters, which meant that the IL-2 sometimes had to be used for patrols and air-to-air combat. The IL-2 was clearly outclassed by the German Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters. However, the IL-2 proved itself capable of shooting down other types of aircraft. The Henschel HS-126 reconnaissance plane came under attack by the IL-2 fairly often and suffered heavy losses. Close formations of Junker Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers were also commonly attacked by IL-2s, as the 7.92mm machine guns the Stukas were equipped with could not penetrate the IL-2's armour. The German Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft also suffered at the hand of the IL-2. Around the time of the Battle of Stalingrad, many bombers like the Heinkel He-111 and Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor were desperately trying to deliver supplies to the encircled German 6th Army, and were shot down by IL-2s in considerable numbers. The IL-2's fighting capabilities were still quite subpar, which led to it taking more losses from fighters than any other aircraft in the Soviet Air Force throughout the war. A tactic used by IL-2 pilots to best enemy fighters was to fly at low altitudes and speeds, causing the enemy fighters to overshoot them, leaving them in the sights of the IL-2. The IL-2's rockets, although capable of knocking out most armoured targets in a single blow, were rather inaccurate, and as a result had to be used at relatively close range, at which they were highly effective. This led to many pilots preferring to use their cannons against their targets at long ranges and saving their rockets for high-priority targets. The heavier bombs were usually reserved for heavier targets like heavy tanks, buildings, or bridges, and finally the small bombs were used against light tanks and supply trucks. The IL-2's heavy armour proved quite effective, as it was indeed a difficult plane to down, taking a lot of punishment before falling from the sky, giving it the nickname the Flying Tank, or the Cement Bomber, translating to the Concrete Bomber. The IL-2 could reportedly take many rounds from 20mm anti-air guns, and was generally too fast and manoeuvrable to be effectively targeted by larger caliber anti-air defences. The IL-2 was by no means impervious to anti-air guns, with around half of all downed IL-2s being downed by anti-aircraft guns. A high percentage of the IL-2's losses were also attributed to enemy fighters. In order to counteract enemy fighters, some IL-2 models began to bear a modified design, which turned the plane into a two-seater, once again with a rear gunner. Early two-seater variants literally just sawed a hole into the plane, wherein the gunner would sit in a canvas sling armed with a 12.7mm machine gun mounted to the fuselage. Later though, models would be constructed with a proper gunner compartment incorporated. The inclusion of a gunner slowed the plane down by approximately 10 to 20 km per hour and added 170 kilograms, which shifted the centre of gravity back slightly, making the plane harder to handle. To avoid further increasing the plane's weight, the armouring around the gunner was only thick enough to stop rifle caliber munitions, with only 6mm of armouring around the gunner, which unsurprisingly led to the gunners having a much higher death rate than that of the pilots, who were protected by up to 12mm of armour. Nonetheless, the gunners proved quite effective at fending off enemy fighters. To combat the new variant's performance issues, development began on an upgraded AM-38 engine, the AM-38S, and entered production on the 30th of October 1942. In January of 1943, the engine would once again be upgraded with the AM-38F. Despite the improvements on the engine, the death rate among gunners remained high. Only in later models would the gunner be protected by 13mm of armour. The IL-2 was without a doubt an effective plane. At the Great Tank Battle of Kursk, reportedly 70 tanks were destroyed by IL-2s within only 20 minutes. Warplanes don't usually get produced for long if they aren't effective. However, the extent of the IL-2's effectiveness is rather hard to gauge, as Soviet documents tend to be rather, let's say, unreliable. Let's take another example from the Battle of Kursk. The Soviet Air Force claimed that within an hour, a squadron of IL-2s had destroyed 240 tanks, almost wiping out the entire 17th Panzer Division. However, according to the German records, the 17th Panzer Division at the time only had one operational panzer battalion with only 67 tanks. So that's 173 less than the Soviets claim to have destroyed. This isn't a single case either. There are many more just like it. It's estimated that at the Battle of Kursk, only 2 to 5% of the German tank losses were due to IL-2s. The ongoing problem with the IL-2 was that its attacks were fairly inaccurate, which made it pretty poor when attacking against entrenched or singular targets. Planes like the P-47 Thunderbolt and Hawker Typhoon were capable of much higher precision. The IL-2's main strength was in attacking large groupings or columns of vehicles. Soviet engineers were aware of the plane's strengths and worked to create an armament that would take advantage of these. The PTAB, or PTAB as I'm going to call it, the anti-tank aviation bomb, was introduced in 1943, and the IL-2 tactics changed even further. These bombs weighed only 2.5 kilograms and contained 1.5 kilograms of explosives. This meant that the IL-2 could carry up to 192 of them within 4x48 cassettes, or even 220 when additional PTABs were stored within the inner wing panels. Although the PTAB was small, it could penetrate up to 60 to 70 millimeters of tank armor, which was more than enough to deal with the German heavy tanks like the Panther and Tiger I. This new bomb made strafing along the convoy a much more viable tactic, as the IL-2 could effectively carpet bomb an entire column. This further strengthened the circle tactic and made the IL-2 a horrifying sight for German panzer divisions and supply convoys alike, leading to a stark increase in anti-air armaments on the side of the Germans on the Eastern Front. Notable pilots of the IL-2 Sturmovik include Anna Yegorova, who flew 243 missions and was awarded 3 medals, including the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union. All the while, she was imprisoned in a German POW camp, which she luckily survived. Ivan Grigorovich Dachenko, who was also awarded with the same medal as Yegorova in addition to all 3 classes of the Order of Glory. And last but not least, N.T. Kuznetsov, who was bestowed with the same honor as the previous 2 pilots. Kuznetsov was shot down by a Bf-109 when returning from a reconnaissance mission over Kalinin and was forced to crash land. Upon landing, he exited his plane and hid nearby. Much to his surprise, the German fighter plane landed relatively close to inspect the wreck. Seeing the German pilot exit his plane and walk to the broken down IL-2, Kuznetsov saw his chance and ran to the empty Bf-109 and took off in it, and managed to fly home without being shot down by friendly aircraft, miraculously enough. I'd like to know how that German pilot explained himself. The IL-2 was without a doubt one of the best ground attack planes of all of World War II, and one of the best planes on the sides of the Soviet Union. The IL-2 started the war with only 249 units produced, and ended with a grand total of 36,183, making it the most produced plane of all of World War II. The Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik and its pilots will forever be remembered for their vital role in the Great Patriotic War. Well, if you've made it this far into the video, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching. Please consider subscribing, leaving a rating, or sharing this video with people you think might also be interested in the topic. And please give suggestions for future content in the comments below. Anyways, thanks a lot for watching. See you next time.